Hello everyone, and welcome to the very first lecture for chapter 14. So in this chapter, we're going to take a look at kind of the second half of the period that we call the Middle Ages, or medieval times. Obviously the focus here for this first lecture and into some of these is going to be the Crusades and the role of the church, as you can see here with the title Church Reform and the Crusades. But we're also going to talk about what some of the effects of the Crusades are, and then what's going on in Europe during this time as we're moving forward to the period that we call the Renaissance. So really, kind of what's developing in mainly Western Europe during the latter half of the Middle Ages is really the focus of this chapter. All right, so let's get started. We're going to first talk about the church and the Crusades here. So there's some problems going on in the church, and we talked a little bit about these issues, not as much directly as we will hear back in chapter 13, but we're starting to see the breakdown of the church in some forms. If you remember back in chapter 13, we talked about how learning started to break down with the fall of the Western Roman Empire and all the invasions from different groups into Western Europe. Well, that breakdown in education, although it takes a much longer period of time, starts to hit the church. Priests are starting to become illiterate, which is a big issue because, I mean, they aren't able to read the Bible or other texts that they need to actually help with the religion and help strengthen it. So that's a big issue. You're starting to see popes using questionable morals. They're not necessarily staying with the traditional beliefs and traditional actions that a pope had and is supposed to do. And then you're starting to see that really the access to money is becoming a problem. The riches that are getting into the church are becoming a problem because people are playing off their greed. We're inherently greedy, and religious officials are no different really at this time. So the main problems are you're starting to see priests marrying and having families, which may not seem like the biggest deal, and it's probably the lesser of all the evils in terms of these problems because we see many priests have families, but this is an issue specifically back then. We're seeing the issue with lay investiture in terms of the appointment of officials by kings and so forth, and then bishops selling positions in the church, and basically what's called simony. And this is a big problem in terms of you're seeing corruption across the Christian church during this period. So there's a lot of people that start to push for reform. In particular, as you see at the top of the screen, Popes Leo the Ninth and Gregory the Seventh actually passed laws to enforce actions against the process of simony, and then as well as marriage, particularly in the scope of marriage against religious officials marrying, because they're technically not supposed to at certain levels. And so basically what ends up happening is you see in this period of the crusade, during the Crusades and the years after, that the Catholic Church really gets structured as a political kingdom. If you were to look at the Catholic Church's structure versus what you see like in France or England, it looks pretty much the exact same as a typical kingdom with the Pope at the top. And we kind of looked at kind of the hierarchy. If you remember back to one of the lectures in chapter 13, we saw that hierarchy with the Pope, archbishops, and cardinals, and all the way down to the priests. Kind of like that, but even more structured now as there's a political element to it, and these laws coming in. And then there's also kind of what's called a curia, and then it's a court of advisors. They're the ones that help actually develop the law system that the church uses. We talked about this in the previous chapter as well. The church's law is known as canon law, the accepted law, and so forth. So that's really kind of how they start. You see reform in terms of structuring the system itself. And then there's other actions to help reform. The Pope starts using diplomats and figures to actually go throughout the area that they have influence over to settle differences on church matters or between different groups of Christians. Like if, let's say, France is fighting England or something like that, they're using diplomats to help them get their job done, to meet political and religious needs, in that way. And then also the collection, a better system in terms of the collecting of the tithes so that the church has access to money. And again, it's more focused on using this money for the poor and for hospitals of the like, and making sure that money actually goes where it's supposed to. All right, so there's some religious orders that are actually developed during this period as well, more towards the latter part of what we're talking about. So, like, if we're talking about the Crusades, we're towards the kind of the middle section of the Crusader period with the early 1200s. You start to see various monks and other religious officials travel across Europe, and they directly preach to the poor or the lower classes. In particular, two groups that developed during this period are the Dominicans, founded by Dominic, where it's a focus really on the Christian teachings, but focus on learning. And then you have Franciscans, founded by the Franciscans of Assisi, and they focus on the idea that all creatures are spiritual. There's a connection with nature. Kind of a similar touch to like when we talked about when we talk about Japanese culture in the early days, their link with the kami or the spirits of nature. There's a similar comparison there as well. And also you start to see the role of women, which had been diminished for quite some time in the Catholic Church, starts to expand. They play a more prominent role spreading religion and working with the poor, and also playing a role in hospitals and working with the sick as nurses and so forth. All right, so with all this going on, you actually have a development of there's technological developments and changes in styles during this period, from what we see in the early ages or the early half of the medieval ages to the second half, and then leading into the Renaissance. We see a style change in terms of the development of particularly churches and cathedrals. And cathedrals were supposed to be the representation of the city of God, so heaven. And so from 800 to 1100, you actually have what's called the Romanesque style that gets developed. Basically, what this is if you see on the top picture here, you have rounded arches, very small windows, as you can see, and there's little light that actually can go in. These are that gets through these because they're small windows. This is what you call a Romanesque style. Now, as there's a new spirit in the latter half of the Middle Ages comes into religion because of the reforms and trying to root out corruption, and there's more money coming in, you have a new style, and because of that develops because of this new spirit, because of new technologies, and so forth, in terms of helping with building and techniques. You have what's known as the Gothic style, and you can see the Gothic style down here, and we'll look at some pictures here in the next couple of slides so you can see some more examples. Very tall, more reaching buildings, more grandiose in what they look like. They have what are called vaulted arches, which is this is a vaulted arch here, and we'll look at some in here, and so forth. Very large windows, letting a lot of light in. Very intricate forms of art on these windows. Typically, I mean, you guys have all seen them if you've been to a church. Here, if you see kind of the big glass stained windows with some kind of artistic representation, whether it's a flower, whether it's a story from the Bible or whatever, trying to show the significance of God. The biggest example of this is the Notre Dame Cathedral, or at least maybe not the biggest example, but the most famous example is the Notre Dame Cathedral in the center of Paris, which they're restoring now because of the fire that happened about a little over a year ago. But here's kind of what I'm talking about. So on the left, you have your Romanesque style, very beautiful churches in their own right. But you can see they're not necessarily as intricate in terms of the decoration on the outside. They have the smaller arches, smaller windows. And then here, look at these. These are what you would call Gothic style. This is what I meant by a vaulted arch. Okay, and these big glass windows let a lot of light in, and they're very tall and reaching. And here's Notre Dame, I know it's not the best quality of picture, but this is what, there's plenty of things that are getting restored here because of the fire, but in particular, this steeple fell. Very, very heartbreaking in terms of seeing the video of that falling. All right, so we're going to move on to the second half of this lecture. We talked about church reform and the roles of the church during this period. Now we're going to talk about the Crusades, and we're going to do a lot with the Crusades. Not only the causes, but the effects, because we still see them to this day in some ways. So as you see this reform in the church and this rise in this faith, or this rise in the spirit of Christianity, and trying to take out corruption from the church standpoint, you see that there's this renewed movement for Christians to retake the Holy Land. And there's a number of reasons for this. One, there's one that's not listed here, is that we talked about previously back in, I believe it was the end of chapter 11, with the Seljuk Turks. The leader of the Muslim Empire there dies in 1092, and the Muslim area splits into a number of different, under control of a number of different people and groups. So there's kind of an opportunity there that's not listed on this page, but you're looking at, there's the opportunity to reclaim the Holy Land and reunite what they call all of Christendom, because there's a connection of the Holy Land to the Eastern Roman or the Byzantine Empire. We've talked about this before, the opportunity for Europe to use their knights, because their knights in a lot of ways are very thuggish in causing violence on Christians against each other. It's an opportunity to use them for what they're good at, fighting against an enemy that's different. It's also an opportunity to strengthen Western Christians with Eastern Christians, or the Byzantine Empire. And then really, for economically, it's an opportunity for connecting in profits and trade, and linking to the East, trying to find ways to trade with all the people to the East, even past the Middle East and into like India and China, kind of linking the Silk Road routes that we've talked about previously. And then just for the individual person, because life is so difficult during this period, it offers a chance at salvation because it's a religious undertaking, but also you have the ability to have access to riches if you're trading, or access land if you're lucky enough to even get an estate in the Holy Land if they take control. So there's a lot of benefits and opportunities here, and goals for the Crusades. And Pope Urban II is the one that calls it in 1095. So here's the route of the First Crusade. You can see that it starts in a couple of different places, mostly in France, and makes their way through Rome and then across the Balkans and then to Constantinople. And one of the reasons why the Crusades is called, that I didn't mention previously, is the Byzantine Emperor Alexius at the time actually sends a letter out to Christian Europe to say they need help because they've been being attacked by many different Muslim groups on their borders and so forth. So that's another reason they're answering the call. It's one of the reasons why they go to Constantinople. And the First Crusade, the Crusaders take the route across Anatolia, down to and down into the Holy Land, ending in Jerusalem. So with the First Crusade, it's called in 1095. It takes 2 years for 3 different Christian armies to meet up in Constantinople. It takes some time to get everything together. The army's very ill prepared. There's arguments between the different armies because of where they come from, who's actually going to gain control, or if the Byzantines are going to play a role, what have you. There's a lot of arguments going on between them. But they do make their way across Anatolia and down to Jerusalem over a couple years. There's fighting specifically at Antioch and Edessa, and those become 2 very strong Crusader states in the years moving forward. But in 1099, the Christian forces, the Crusader forces, are able to capture Jerusalem. Now, what they do is when they attack the city, they kill everybody that's inside that's not Christian. Doesn't matter if they kill Jews, they kill Arabs, they kill people that aren't of those faiths. Doesn't matter if they're a child, a woman, elderly, they kill everybody that's non-Christian in that in the city. And that'll play a role later on and is important moving forward. And we've talked a little bit about this before, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But they establish a Crusader kingdom that's very, very vulnerable. It stretches essentially, kind of balloons out here to Edessa, and then kind of goes along the coast with Antioch in the north here, um, and then all the way down to Jerusalem. But it's a very thin, vulnerable Christian kingdom. Now, the Second Crusade that happens is organized to recapture the Crusader state of Edessa, which is retaken by the Muslim forces, particularly that of under Saladin. Now, the campaigns go and there's fighting, but eventually what ends up happening, this happens just under 100 years later, Saladin is able to retake Jerusalem for the Muslims. And he lays siege to the city. There's an agreement that the city will be open under this. And now the Christian forces, the Crusader states have lost control of the holy city of Jerusalem. So what this does is it leads to the Third Crusade, which is immediately upon news of Jerusalem falling to Saladin's forces, is immediately organized with the main goal we have that Christians have to retake the city. There are three main leaders that are part of this Third Crusade: Philip II of France, Frederick I or Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, and Richard the Lionhearted of England. Philip ends up deciding to go home on the trek to the Holy Land. Frederick, on the way there, dies. We talked about this previously. And then that leaves King Richard the Lionhearted to be the main Crusader leader. And he's going to fight many great battles against Saladin. And they're going to there's going to be a mutual respect that's going to develop between the two for their military skills. And we'll actually read some of the events in terms of what happened between the Muslim forces and the Crusader forces of Richard and Saladin during this time. So you guys can look at some primary sources of how people were treated and what during these battles and what different views each side had. But eventually what ends up happening is Richard and Saladin settle down and come to an agreement of peace in 1192. The Third Crusade is ultimately not successful in regaining the Holy Land, but it does, with the agreement between these two leaders, it sets it up so that Jerusalem stays in the hands of Muslim control, but it's open freely to all Christians to come into the city, worship as they need, and leave or stay there. So it's agreed to be an open city, and again, not just for Muslims and Christians, but for Jews as well. So this map here, this is an important one. I want you guys to make sure you come back to this. You will actually see this map, maybe a little bit differently, but pretty much this map. It will be will play a prominent role in your test for chapter 14. So please make sure you guys actually take a bit to kind of review this, see what the main routes are, and kind of where they stopped and where what areas were under control of whom, because it'll play an important role. If you can understand that, it'll make it a lot easier for you to answer questions on the test and get them right and do it quickly. All right, so now we're going to move on to what was called the Children's Crusade. This is a very, very sad event in history. There's several subsequent crusades that take place to go after by the Christian forces to retake Jerusalem. They all fail. The Fourth Crusade doesn't even get to the Holy Land. It gets to Constantinople, which is a Christian city, and sacks the city. So they fail all miserably, these crusades, these remaining crusades. But so what happens is in 1212, groups of children are organized all across Europe to try and take Jerusalem. There's roughly 30,000 from the area of France, 20,000 from Germany, as well as some from others. But ultimately, it essentially turns into this death march where thousands of children die from the weather, particularly because it's cold in many of the places, because of the time of year they're going through. And then also from starvation, they have lack of food. And then what ultimately ends up happening is it fails so miserably. Many of these children die, and most are sold into slavery or drown in boats that sink, or have already died from starvation or cold. And essentially, what ends up happening, only about 2,000 of these children out of roughly 50 to 60,000 survive. It's very, very sad, and just a tremendously horrible stain um, on history. All right, so now we're just a couple slides left. We're going to talk about the Reconquista. We'll actually come back to this when we reventure into like chapter 18, or we get into chapter 18 and look more into the history of the Muslim world during this period, as well as when we get into the age of exploration and why like Spain and Portugal are able to become these big exploration powers. We'll talk about the Reconquista again. So this is in the really kind of the end of the period of what we call the Middle Ages and in the beginning of the Renaissance. Kind of a mixture of it, of the two periods. But Spain, most of Spain for a time was controlled by the Muslims. We've talked about this previously. The Reconquista is the event or the effort for the Christian forces in Spain and Portugal to push the Muslims out of the Iberian Peninsula. And it ends in 1492 when the very famous King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain take what is known as Granada, which is down here. It's marked as Al-Andalus on this map because that was the Muslim state there, if you guys recall. And this ends the Reconquista, or accomplishes the feat of Reconquista for the Spanish by pushing the Muslim forces out of the peninsula. What happens after this is it begins the process of the Spanish Inquisition, and that will actually expand throughout the rest of Christian Europe. And it's essentially these courts that are set up to suppress heresy against the Christian faith. So what ends up happening is many Jews and Muslims and Christians really end up getting attacked and either forcibly converted in the terms of the Jews or Muslims, or they may convert so that they aren't harmed. But there's a lot of people that are questioned, jailed, or even tortured, and some, in certain instances, are even burned at the stake alive. So it's this religious movement, the Inquisition, to attack any heretical ideas and groups that are against Christianity in Europe at this time. Here you can see this is just a better vision, a bigger version of the map that you have on the previous slide. So you can kind of see these are the kingdoms of Spain that eventually unite together to create what we know as present-day Spain today. And then you have Portugal, and then they push the Muslims out of Spain in 1492. All right, this is the last slide here. The effects of the Crusade. I would start this one, review this one. It's very, very important. One, it shows the Crusades. There's all these different efforts to retake the Holy Land, and it shows over hundreds of years, and it shows the power of the church. You see you see thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, that leave their homes to fight in the name of God. You start to see women gaining opportunities to manage estates and businesses because their husbands are away fighting in the Crusades. Now, this is going to begin a very small sliver, but it's the beginning of women gaining more rights. It's going to take a very, very long time, and they're still fighting that a lot to this day, but this is a small sliver in that opportunity to gain that. You'll start to see trade and learning expand across Europe and Asia, and see the connections and access to older pieces of knowledge, particularly from like the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans, come back to Western Europe. And that's important, and we'll talk more about that specifically in the days ahead, but we'll really kind of venture that and kind of look into that really effect of that expansion with the Renaissance, because that will really kind of foster the Renaissance, the idea of expanding of learning and trade. You're going to see papal power, the Pope's power, Church's power at the end of the crusading period really diminish, because you see a failing in a religious instance to retake the Holy Land, and that kind of leaves a power vacuum for who's going to gain the power, gain the most influence. And you'll see the kings of Europe gain that, and we'll talk about that moving forward. You ultimately see in 1453 the Byzantine Empire falls because of this failure, and many other factors as well, that some we've already talked about and others that we'll talk about moving forward in this chapter. And then when we get into the Ottomans actually taking this city and ending the Byzantine Empire in 1453. When we talk about chapter 18, you see an increased persecution of Jews in Europe. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about this moving forward, specifically why that is. But essentially, we see all throughout history, Jews, for whatever reason, are looked at as outsiders, even in the case of Christians looking at them as outsiders, and they're persecuted for many things that they really had no involvement in, or they shouldn't be blamed for. And then obviously the big one here that we still really see to this day is the bitterness that is going to develop between Christian areas and Muslim areas, and that animosity. And we still see that that fight going on to this day in many areas. All right, guys, that's all I got for you. I know this one was one of the longer ones that we have for the year. So thank you for staying in there. Please make sure you guys go back on this one. This is a really important one, specifically this slide. And I will see you guys in the next video.